Welcome to Shuffle Source. I'm your host Brandon, and we are back with the new year, kicking things off with a new Commander Precon upgrade video. This time we will be upgrading the Blight Curse Precon from Lorwyn Eclipsed. Let's get into it. Really fast before discussing the Commander, let's quickly go over the Precon upgrade format that we use here at Shuffle Source. The first item to note is that we will either use the primary or the backup Commander. Next, we have a cap of around $100 or less that we use when choosing the upgrades. We will be adding 10 cards, and we will also be removing 10 cards. Additionally, we do add a few what we call no budget options near the end of the video for people who either already have the cards or maybe have a little bit more in their budget to spend. And lastly, we do use market value pricing provided by TCG Player at the time of recording, which is displayed at the bottom of the screen as we discuss the cards. The commander we will be discussing today is Auntie Cursewretch. For 1 and Jund, which is black, red, and green, we have a 4/4 legendary creature Goblin Warlock that has Ward Blight 2. To Blight 2, a player puts 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature they control. Whenever one or more -1/-1 counters are put on a creature, draw a card if you control that creature. If you don't control it, its controller loses 1 life. So as you can probably tell right off the bat, this deck is all about -1/-1 counters, and Auntie is going to help us get payoffs for them on both sides of the table. If the -1/-1 counters go on our creatures, we get value from them in the form of card draw, which is important for keeping our hand full to accelerate our game plan. Now on the flip side, if the -1/-1 counters go on our opponent's creatures, they're going to lose life, which is great because it will chip away at their life totals over the course of the game. Now it is important to note that the text says whenever one or more -1/-1 counters are placed on a creature, which means it doesn't matter if you're putting 1 counter or you're putting 5 counters on the same creature, it's only going to trigger her ability once. Our commander's ability doesn't care about how many counters that were put on in that single instance. It only cares about each individual instance of placing -1/-1 counters. So instead of big splashy effects that dump a bunch of counters on any single creature at once, the deck really wants lots of small, repeatable ways to give out the -1/-1 counters to be able to trigger our commander as much as possible. Lastly, let's not forget her Ward 2 ability. If an opponent wants to target her directly, they have to put 2 -1/-1 counters on their own creature, which means they will lose 1 life and weaken their board. While it is not the largest kind of deterrent from targeting her, it is still a cost on the opponent for targeting your commander. So the way we want to upgrade this deck is by reinforcing what this deck is already trying to do. We want to add more cards that add -1/-1 counters. We want to add more -1/-1 counter payoffs, and we finally want to improve our card draw and ramp package. It's also important to note that this deck does have some access to some infinite combos. All of the combos tend to leverage a card called Blowfly Infestation, which is a 2 and a black enchantment that says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, if it had a -1/-1 counter on it, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Now, like I said, there are several pieces that can leverage Blowfly Infestation to go infinite with, but here is one particular combo you can do which will just outright win you the game. If you have Blowfly Infestation, Flourishing Defenses, and Grave Venerations on the board, you can drain your opponent's life totals all the way down to 0. Now, in order to get this combo to work, you're going to need ideally 2 1/1 creatures on the battlefield, and then you're going to have to do some sort of action that will cause a -1/-1 counter to be placed. Blighting, for example, or any of the other cards in the deck that will place the -1/-1 counter. So how this loop works is you put the counter on one of the 1/1s, that creature will die. The death triggers for all 3 enchantments will go off. While stacking the triggers, you want to make sure Flourishing Defenses resolves first, creating the 1/1. Then you want to have Blowfly Infestation resolving, putting the -1/-1 counter on the other 1/1 that you had. That 1/1 will die, which will restart the loop. Each iteration of this obviously gives you another token creature that you can then continue to put -1/-1 counters on and really keep the loop going, all while Grave Veneration is going to drain the board for every time that loop happens. It also doesn't necessarily have to be Flourishing Defenses. You also have Hapatra in there, and you'll also see that I'm adding another card in our additions that can also work with the infinite combo as well. If you like infinite combos, cool. Be sure to keep that in there and really try to build that puzzle and try to win that way. If you're not so big on infinite combos, then you can easily replace a few of these cards out of the deck. However, this is actually a really fun way to win with this deck. A special thanks to all of our channel members. Your support truly means a lot and we greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to show your support and get access to some exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. You can also support the channel by liking, subscribing, and dropping a comment. Thank you, and now let's get back to the video. We've now made it to the first of the additions, and we're going to kick things off with Cankerbloom. For 1 and a green, we have a 3/2 creature Phyrexian fungus that you can pay 1, sacrifice Cankerbloom, choose 1. Destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or proliferate. So the reason we want to add Cankerbloom is because it is a flexible utility creature that's going to give us a little bit of extra removal, but if we also don't need the removal, we can leverage the proliferate. Proliferating is going to allow us to add more -1/-1 counters on each of the creatures that we want that already have -1/- counters on it, which will trigger our commander Auntie and any of the other -1/-1 payoffs that we have. Having options is always strong, and this either gives us much needed removal or proliferate on a stick. And here's our next card, Darkness Descends. For 2 and 2 black, we have a sorcery that says put 2 -1/-1 counters on each creature. So Darkness Descends is a really good way to put -1/-1 counters across the board. Even though it is just one spell, it puts the counters on every creature, which means Auntie triggers for each creature individually. So if there's quite a bit of creatures on the board, this means we can get a huge burst of card draw if it's on our side of the board, or a lot of loss of life across our opponents if they have a lot of creatures on the board. It's also nice that it helps shrink down the board, and it can in some cases act as a pseudo board wipe for a lot of smaller creatures. Here we have Farseek. For 1 and a green, we have a sorcery that says search your library for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Farseek is just a really good no-nonsense ramp card. It helps fix our colors early, it lets us hit Auntie on time or even a turn early, and it just keeps the deck moving without asking us to jump through much hoops. In a 3-color deck that really wants to set up its engines quickly, consistency like this is really important, and our deck definitely needs more ramp. Also, if you can get your hands on a Nature's Lore and a 3 Visits, I would also recommend adding them to the deck as well. Here's our next addition, Generous Patron. For 2 and a green, we have a 1/4 creature Elf Advisor that says when Generous Patron enters the battlefield, support 2. Put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, draw a card. So Generous Patron is a great inclusion here because it turns putting counters on our opponent's creatures, which we're really trying to do, into straight up card draw. Auntie already allows us some card draw when we put counters on our own creatures, but now we're going to get card draw off of either way, from Auntie or Generous Patron. And honestly, we're not too sad about the downside of the enters the battlefield trigger. Sure, we can put a couple of +1/+1 counters on our opponent's creatures, draw a few cards, and then just shrink them down later. Also, don't forget the political aspect that this card brings you. You can work out a deal with one of your opponents where if you give one of their creatures the +1/+1 counters from the support ability, maybe they don't attack you for a turn, or maybe they just promise to swing that creature at one of your other opponents. Next up, we have Nest of Scarabs. For 2 colorless and 1 black, we have an enchantment that says whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. Now, Nest of Scarabs is another excellent support card for Auntie because it doubles down on exactly what the deck is trying to do, and that is getting value from our -1/-1 counters. Every time we place a -1/-1 counter, not only will we trigger Auntie if she's on the battlefield, but we're also going to build our board at the same time with the 1/1 black insect tokens. Now, one thing to notice here that really puts this card a cut above the rest is that the text here says create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. Unlike Auntie who doesn't get extra value from putting a large number of -1/-1 counters on a single creature in one go, Nest of Scarabs actually does scale with those bigger counter placements. In other words, if you do have an effect that puts multiple -1/-1 counters on a creature, you're going to get that many tokens, which is very powerful. Lastly, this is the additional infinite combo card I was talking about adding. You can definitely use this card to also go infinite in this deck. And here we have our next addition, Obelisk Spider. For 1, a black and a green, we have a 1/4 creature spider with reach. Whenever Obelisk Spider deals combat damage to a creature, put a -1/-1 counter on that creature. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So honestly, this card is essentially an auto-include in my opinion. It's such a great fit here because it turns every -1/-1 counter we place into table-wide life drain. Since Auntie already wants us to trigger those counters in a lot of small, repeatable ways, this stacks perfectly with that game plan and helps us work on closing out the game. On top of that, this card can even create its own -1/-1 counter triggers just by attacking and blocking creatures. Honestly, I was quite surprised that this was not in the Precon to start with. It just synergizes with the deck in every way. Here we have Persistent Constrictor. For 4 colorless and a black, we have a 5/3 creature zombie snake that says, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they lose 1 life and you put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature they control. It also has Persist, which means whenever this creature dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you get to return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. So Persistent Constrictor is a great repeatable -1/-1 counter engine that triggers on every opponent's upkeep. Not only does the card drain your opponents for life on its own, but if Auntie is out and they control a creature, it will also trigger her ability for an additional loss of life. This ability also stacks nicely with a lot of our other -1/-1 payoffs that we have in this deck, all while steadily weakening our opponent's boards. On top of that, it is also a pretty resilient creature with the fact that it has Persist, so if it gets removed, we can bring it back. Next, we have Scuzzback Scrounger. For 1 in a red, we have a 3/2 creature Goblin Warrior that says, at the beginning of your first main phase, you may blight 1. If you do, create a treasure token. So the reason I wanted to add this card is because it is a low cost utility creature. If Auntie is also on the battlefield, blighting one of our own creatures will trigger Auntie to draw us a card, and then in addition, we're now going to get a treasure as well. So effectively with this card and Auntie on the battlefield, we're converting a single -1/-1 counter on our own creature into both card advantage and ramp. So it's a repeatable low cost way to really help us accelerate our game plan. Here we have Staff of Completion. For 3 colorless, it is an artifact that has a tap ability, pay 1 life, destroy target permanent you own, pay 2 life, add 1 mana of any color, pay 3 life, proliferate, pay 4 life, draw a card, or you can pay 5, untap this artifact. So in Commander, we have 40 life, which is quite a bit of life, and Staff of Completion will let us leverage our life total for some value. Now that can be in the form of gaining some mana or drawing a card, but the real reason it's in this deck is because of the proliferate. And then being able to pay mana to untap it means we can use that proliferate multiple times a turn. Now, as you can imagine, with Auntie and our other -1/-1 payoffs that we have on the battlefield, that can lead to some really explosive turns of card draw or table-wide damage. Depending on the board state and us having the right pieces, repeatedly proliferating the -1/-1 counters on creatures in a single turn can just outright win us the game. And here we have the last of our additions. We have Yawgmoth Thran Physician. For 2 colors and 2 black, we have a 2/4 legendary creature human cleric that has protection from humans, pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card, or you can pay 2 black, discard a card, and proliferate. So Yawgmoth is basically a second engine for this deck. He offers us a repeatable way to put -1/-1 counters at instant speed, which will trigger Auntie and a lot of our other -1/-1 payoffs while also drawing us cards. The Sacrifice Outlet also pairs well with a lot of the token generators that we have, and the Proliferate will let us add additional -1/-1 counters to creatures that already have them. And since Proliferate adds another counter, it is a new instance, so it's perfect for triggering things with Auntie or any of our other payoffs to help us with value or closing out the game. Now, it's definitely one of our more pricey upgrades, but it is an excellent addition to the deck. We've now made it to the removals portion of the video, and we are going to kick things off with Archfiend of Ifnir. For 3 colorless and 2 black, we have a 5/4 creature demon that has flying. Whenever you cycle or discard another card, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. It also has cycling too, which means you can discard this card and draw a card. Now don't get me wrong, this is a very powerful card, but this isn't the deck for it. We just don't have nearly enough cycling or discarding card effects to ever really make good use of its ability. So quite simply, without that support, it's just a 5 mana flyer that doesn't really help us advance our gameplay on its own very reliably. Our next removal is Cathartic Pyre. For 1 colorless and a red, we have an instant that says choose 1. Cathartic Pyre deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. Cathartic Pyre does offer some flexibility. but the discard and draw mode once again pushes us towards a discard sub-theme, which we're not actually supporting. We'd rather use our card slots on cards that consistently advance our -1/-1 counter engine instead of situationally looting or small removal effects. Not to mention this deck has access to black, so we already have access to much more efficient creature removal. And here we have Cathartic Reunion for 1 and a red. We have a sorcery that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard 2 cards, draw 3 cards. Now, I'm sure this card was probably included in the Precon to help support Archfiend of Ifnir, but it's not enough to really fully lean into. Now, while this card can actually be quite useful in decks that care about discarding or using their graveyard as a resource, this deck isn't really focused on either of those strategies. Instead, we actually have access to more reliable sources of card draw that doesn't require us to give up cards to get that value. Our next removal is Ferafor Young Yu. For 6 colorless and a green, we have a 4/7 legendary creature Treefolk Druid that says, when Ferafor enters, create a number of 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens equal to the number of counters among creatures target players controls. You can also tap it, double the number of each kind of counter on target creature. So 7 mana is a lot of mana to pay for a card that really isn't optimized for a -1/-1 counter based deck. To truly maximize this card, in my opinion, especially on that enters the battlefield effect, you're going to want to run this in a +1/+1 counter deck where you're intentionally stacking counters on your own creatures. Those kind of decks can really control the number of counters in play and can really help you set up much more explosive turns when it hits the battlefield. Here we have Grave Titan. For 4 colorless and 2 black, we have a 6/6 creature giant that has Death Touch. Whenever this creature enters or attacks, create 2 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. So Grave Titan really doesn't fit the theme of this deck. While it is a creature that can repeatedly generate tokens, it doesn't interact with our -1/-1 counter strategy in really any meaningful way. This card is actually really better suited for any sort of zombie focused base deck, and at the cost of 6, we'd rather be playing cards that directly support our synergies instead of just adding raw power. Next we have Gruul Turf, which is a land that comes into play tapped, and whenever this land enters, return a land you control to its owner's hand. It also taps for a red and a green. So this deck is running 39 lands out of the box, which in my opinion is about 2 lands too many. Now, unless you are a landfall deck, which this isn't, I tend to run my decks at around 37 lands. On top of that, I tend to remove cards that always enter the battlefield tapped whenever I can. Gruul Turf is also a bounce land, which I'm typically not a fan of. Now, bounce lands can be decent in, of course, landfall based decks, but that's not what this deck is. Our next removal is Hoarder's Greed. For 3 colorless and a black, we have a sorcery that says you lose 2 life and draw 2 cards. Then clash with an opponent. If you win, repeat this process. Hoarder's Greed, in my opinion, is a very inefficient and unreliable card draw spell for this particular deck. At 4 mana, drawing 2 cards is pretty below rate, and the clash mechanic adds randomness instead of consistency. If you enjoy that kind of variance, you can absolutely keep it in. Be my guest, but if you're looking to optimize this deck, in my opinion, this is an easy cut for any of the more consistent and repeatable card draw sources that we're going to be adding. Next up is Liliana Death Wielder. For 5 colorless and 2 black, we have a legendary Planeswalker Liliana that has a starting loyalty of 5. You can +2 put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature. -3 destroy target creature with a -1/-1 counter on it. And -10 return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, while Liliana Death Wielder does look synergistic, the truth is she's just way too slow and inefficient for what this deck is trying to do. 7 mana is a crazy amount of mana for a Planeswalker that only puts a single -1/-1 counter per turn. The -3 ability only destroys creatures that already have counters on them, which we're already technically shrinking or killing them by putting the counters on over time anyway. And lastly, the ultimate ability it has is really only good for a graveyard-based deck, which is not really what we're doing here. Here we have Persist. For 1 and a black, we have a sorcery that says return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. So to me, this feels like one of those cards that they included just because it technically involves a -1/-1 counter. But in practice, its use here is pretty narrow. This deck really isn't focused on recursion or self-mill, so we won't always have a good target for this in our graveyard. Instead, we'd much rather use this card slot for any card that will help us repeatedly get -1/-1 counters on creatures, rather than just some conditional reanimation spell. And the last of our removals is Rakdos Carnarium. It is a land. This land enters tapped. When this land enters, return a land you control to its owner's library, and you can also tap it to add a black and a red. So we're going to be removing this for the exact same reasons that we highlighted with Gruul Turf. The biggest thing against this card is it's always going to come into play tapped, and it can really throw off our early game tempo. Hey everyone, I wanted to take a moment to give a huge shout out to our partner, the Mighty Meeple. If you're in or visiting the Concord, North Carolina area, the Mighty Meeple is the local game store to check out. Their team is friendly, knowledgeable, and always ready to help you find exactly what you need. From Magic and board games to minis and more, whatever your hobby, they've got you covered. And even if you're not local, no problem. You can shop for Magic singles and other TCGs at mightymeeple.com. Thank you, and now let's get back to the video. We've now made it to the no budget options portion of the video, and we are going to kick things off with Maha, its Feathers Knight. For 3 colorless and 2 black, we have a 6/5 legendary creature elemental bird that has flying, trample, ward, discard a card, and creatures your opponents control have base toughness of 1. So not only is Maha a 6/5 flying trampling threat, but in a -1/-1 counter deck, this can just be used as a one-sided board wipe. By setting all of our opponent's creatures to base toughness of 1, any creature that already has a -1/-1 counter on it will immediately die. And if Maha sticks around on the table, that static effect applies to everything that comes down afterwards, meaning a single -1/-1 counter is often all it takes to remove any of the new creatures added as well. Now, while having ward of discard a card is not the biggest of deals, it is still making our opponents get rid of a card, which is a resource. Next up, we have Spitting Dilophosaurus for 2 colorless and a black. We have a 3/2 creature dinosaur that says whenever Spitting Dilophosaurus enters the battlefield or attacks, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature. Creatures your opponents control with -1/-1 counters on them can't block. So Spitting Dilophosaurus is a standout card for this deck because it gives us a repeatable source of -1/-1 counters whenever it enters or attacks. These counter placements can then obviously trigger Auntie and any of our other -1/-1 payoffs. On top of that, any creature with a -1/-1 counter on it can't block, which actually helps us push through some combat damage. In some cases, this card can act as a closer. If you put -1/-1 counters across your opponent's board and then drop this, you can swing in freely without worrying about any blockers. And it's worth remembering that this effect applies globally, meaning those creatures can't block anyone. So it can also open the door for opponents to attack each other. And here we have the last of our no budget options. We have Vampiric Tutor for 1 black mana. It is an instant that says search your library for a card, then shuffle and put that card on top, you lose 2 life. So Vampiric Tutor is here purely for consistency. It lets us find whatever piece we're missing at the time, whether that's a -1/-1 counter engine, a payoff, or for a way for us to close out the game, all at instant speed. Losing 2 life is a small price to pay for having access to the right card at the right time. You can even use it to help you find the pieces you need to set off your infinite combos. And there you have it. After upgrading this Precon, we have a final upgrade cost of $74.12. This total does not include the no budget options that we covered. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos. Let me know in the comments below what you think about the Blight Curse Precon. Which other cards do you think I should consider adding to the deck? I'd be interested to know. Now, if you want to see the Blight Curse deck in action, you can click the video link here and watch me and 3 of my friends battle it out to see which Precon commander takes the victory. Until next time, thank you for watching.